This happened when I was growing up in the late 90s. My family lived in the suburbs, and there was a lot of forest around there. On the weekends, I would often check out some of the trails and creeks. I wasn't the most popular kid in school back then. There were a few guys in my high school who I was kind of friends with, but it seemed that I was not a real member of their group. One of those guys was Brent. He was a bigger guy. I think he might have been a year older than the rest of us. It's possible that he was held back a year, because he was also not the smartest. He was at least 6 inches taller than the rest of us, with shaggy brown hair. He was also a little overweight, strong though. One Friday afternoon in late October, I was getting ready to head home from school. I was on the sidewalk that led out of the parking lot when Brent came up to me. He told me that one of the guys found an old abandoned house in the woods, and they were all going to check it out that night. He invited me to come. I was pretty thrilled that they decided to include me, because normally I would be left out of things like that. I tried to play it cool though, and told Brent I was in. He told me to meet him at 8 p.m. at the corner of Main and Poplar Street in our town, a spot that was close to the woods. After dinner, I told my mom that I was going out with some friends, but didn't give her any more details. That was common back then. My parents really just let me take off anywhere without much info. I walked down the street feeling excited. I brought my backpack, which had a flashlight, an extra sweatshirt, and a few beers that I stole from my dad. I was early, but when I got to the spot, I could see that Brent was already there waiting. "Hey man, where are the others?" I asked. "They'll be there. Come on, let's go," he said. I was a little confused, but followed his lead. We went into the woods, and when we did, it got really dark. The sun was almost down, and there was no moon. Also, the trees were thick enough that the moonlight would have hardly helped anyway. I couldn't understand why we couldn't just wait for the others. They all lived pretty close by, so I didn't know what the rush was. Still though, I was happy to be out there, and I was looking forward to showing the guys how cool I was for having beer. As we walked, I held my flashlight while Brent had a machete. Definitely not needed for those woods, but he would occasionally slash a shrub out of the way with it. As the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped, so I put on my extra sweatshirt. We walked for about half an hour and hardly said a word. To be honest, Brent was probably the one guy who I hit it off with the least, so it did seem odd that he decided to invite me. Everyone was supposed to be there though, so I thought it didn't really matter. We kept going, but there was no sign of any abandoned house so far. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't just that we were lost, which we clearly were, but something about the situation felt off. I asked Brent how much farther it was, and I suggested that maybe we should turn back. He brushed off my worries, insisting that we were close, but as we continued, it became undeniable that we were wandering aimlessly. Then we entered a clearing in the woods. The trail was faint at best, but our lights were bright. There was a small fire pit that looked like it had been used recently. There was also a pile of empty beer cans, as well as some other trash. Brent stopped walking and turned to me, but didn't say anything. Is this it?" I mumbled. He didn't answer, but held eye contact. The blade of his machete was catching the glow from my flashlight. It was hitting my eyes occasionally, reminding me that he had it. By then, it was pitch dark, and our flashlights were the only thing keeping us from complete darkness. I was feeling scared at that moment, and I was starting to wonder if there was even an abandoned house at all. After an extremely awkward minute, Brent suddenly turned on me. He lunged at me and tackled me to the ground. Within seconds, he had me pinned and the machete held to my throat. He dropped his flashlight on the ground and it landed next to me. Everything happened so fast that I hardly knew what hit me. I remember begging him to let me go, but I can't remember the actual words. Just as he was about to swing at me, I turned off my flashlight, and I reached over and turned off his as well. At that moment, we couldn't see anything. It was completely dark. He was still on top of me, but the sudden loss of light must have confused him, and I was able to squirm out. Brent was breathing heavily, so I knew where he was. The darkness was disorienting, but I didn't dare turn on my light until I knew I could get away from him. Brent lured me out there to kill me, I have no doubt of that. I walked in a basically random direction, in complete darkness. Brent started screaming at me like an animal. I looked back, but I couldn't see anything. It was then that I realized that he must not have been able to find his flashlight after our fight. Otherwise, he would have turned it on and come to get me. I knew he was stuck there. Without a light, there was no way that he could find his way back. I kept walking in the dark. All I was trying to do was get away from Brent. Eventually, his screams became quieter, and I felt safe enough to turn on my flashlight. Surprisingly, I was not far from a trail. It didn't take long before I was able to orient myself and started walking in the right direction. It took over an hour, but I finally made it back to the street. By then, I was shaken up pretty bad. That was when I noticed that I had pissed my pants. Instead of going home right away, I went to a local park and drank the 2 beers that were in my bag. Then I just sat there and waited. By midnight, I finally decided to head home. As I was walking down the sidewalk, it began to rain. By the time I got home, it was pouring, and it was cold. I was happy to get inside. As soon as I got into my house, I was relieved that my family seemed to be in bed already. I didn't want anyone to see me like that, and I didn't want to talk to anyone. I quietly went upstairs and collapsed on my bed. I woke up the next morning with a giant headache and maybe a slight hangover from the beers. It seemed like a bad dream, but I knew it was true. I had the scrapes on my arms to prove it. When I stepped outside onto the wet ground, it finally hit me that Brent may have been out there all night in the cold rain. I knew he didn't have a light, but I thought he may have been able to find his way out anyway. I was too scared of getting in trouble, so I didn't say a word to anyone. I just waited. By the time Monday rolled around, everyone in our town knew that Brent was missing, and I didn't say a word about what happened between us. Since he lured me out there to kill me, I knew he didn't tell anyone either, so I must have been in the clear. It wasn't until the following spring that his body was finally discovered. He was not far from that campsite where he attacked me. The death was ruled an accident, and nobody ever suspected that I had anything to do with it. To be honest, I dealt with some guilt for several years after this happened, but I've since come to terms with it. I was so shaken up by what happened that I genuinely never thought to call for help until it was probably too late anyway. Even after what he did to me, I never wished this for him. Perhaps I owe it to Brent's family to let them know what really happened to him, but in a way, that might cause even more pain, considering what he did. I'm 25 years old, and even though these events happened 11 years ago, I still remember them clearly like it was yesterday. This is by far the creepiest thing I've ever experienced. When I was 14 years old, my family moved out of town into a house situated right in the middle of a cane field. There was a dirt road that led from the main road to the front of our house. The sides and back were surrounded by cane. I was what my parents called a fitness freak because exercise was my thing. I took my dog, whose name was Jet. We went jogging early in the morning and late in the afternoons, every single day. Because we had just moved into this house, and since it was surrounded by cane, I had to find a new track to continue my routine. Our house was 2 stories high, and my bedroom window faced the front of our house, so I could see the main road. After moving my stuff in and settling into my bedroom, I noticed by looking out my window that there was a dirt road on the other side of the main road. I thought it was perfect for a run. It was about 5:30 in the afternoon, the usual time I would go for my jog, so I thought I would check it out. The road was long and narrow, fitting no more than 1 car. There were rows of cane along either side that stood tall, well above my head. I'd been jogging for about 15 minutes, and looking back, I could no longer see the main road. This track was straight, but then slightly curved, leading me towards another house. I could only see the roof of this house off in the distance, because the cane was very high. As I got closer, I noticed a little boy in a red shirt sitting on the roof. He looked to be about 5 or 6 years old. I remember thinking, how on earth did he climb up there? Do his parents know he's up there? For the roof to be visible over the cane, it was obviously a 2-story home. I stopped jogging and called my dog back, who was running a couple meters ahead of me. We turned around to go home. I wasn't interested in going all the way up to that house, just in case it would be trespassing on private property. Or maybe they also had dogs, and mine didn't get along with other pets. When I got home, my dad was sitting on the couch watching TV. I asked him if he knew the family that lived up the opposite dirt road. He told me that nobody lived up there. There must be people who live there. I just saw a little boy sitting on the roof, I told him. My dad looked at me and lowered his eyebrows, as if he didn't believe me. No, Tori, nobody lives up there. It used to be a workhouse that the farmers used to store their tractors and working equipment, my dad explained. I was so confused, questioning whether I had imagined the little boy sitting up there. My 12-year-old sister walked out of the bathroom, drying her hair with a towel. "Gemma, come jogging with me in the morning," I insisted. Why?" she asked. "Because I need to see if I'm just imagining something," I said. She agreed to come. First thing in the morning, I dragged Gemma along to go jogging. We left the dog at home, just in case there really were people living there. "So what were you imagining?" she asked. "Yesterday I went jogging on this road, and down at the end was a house with a little boy sitting on the roof." "So?" she quipped. "So Dad is saying that no one lives there, and it's bothering me." We got close enough to where the roof was finally visible, and there was no little boy in sight. "Let's go all the way to the house then," Gemma said, and I hesitantly followed. When we got close, it became pretty clear that there couldn't possibly be anybody living there. To try to describe it the best I can, it was a large 2-story old house covered in black streaks, as if it had been burned once before. It had 3 large square gaps on the front that clearly used to be windows. The stairs to get inside were at the back of the house, and behind that was a small murky-colored lake. It definitely seemed to be abandoned, and like it hadn't been used in many years. My dad was right about it once being a storage place for farmers. Around the yard were old tires, tractors, and cars. In all honesty, the whole place was straight up creepy. "This is going to be so weird, but do you have a bad feeling of some type?" I asked my sister. Gemma looked at me for a moment before agreeing. Tori, is that the little boy?" she said. Her voice was so shaky. Before I got a chance to ask where, Gemma was pointing towards a small room downstairs, through a smashed hole in the window. Through the window was a little boy just sitting there. We both stared in shock for at least another second, before bolting back to the road. We got home and busted through the door, telling our mom and dad what we saw. Dad laughed. "I told you girls, no one lives there." I was getting frustrated. "Dad, seriously, Gemma saw him too." They both just brushed it off and didn't think much of it. Being dumb teenagers and all, Gemma and I decided to go back to that house that afternoon and take the dog. When we went back there, we checked where we had seen the boy in the morning, but he was gone. Jet was going crazy, so we unclipped the leash from his collar and he took off running behind the house and up the stairs. We called out to him, but he wasn't coming back. "Great, now we have to go and find him," I sighed. We walked around the back and started walking up the stairs slowly. They were old, rickety, and creaky with every step. Gemma got up the stairs before me, because admittedly, I was scared shitless. I was only halfway up before Gemma called out. "Oh my god, what is it? Tori, you have to see this." I walked straight in through the front door, which was missing, and I had chills. I immediately wanted to leave, but Gemma was still calling out to Jet, and he hadn't come back yet. We walked through the kitchen, into an open room of the house, and found Jet sitting there, staring at a large cardboard box, at least a meter tall. We looked inside, and it was filled to the top with videotapes. Every part of me was screaming to get out. Gemma looked at me, and slowly reached in to grab a tape, when we heard quick and heavy footsteps coming from the front of the house, exactly as if somebody were running towards us. We both panicked and got the hell out of there. It was late in the afternoon, and it was getting dark. It started pouring rain as we were running away, and as we got further down the road, we looked back. There was the shape of a large man standing in the gap of the window, watching us. When we got home, we were sweaty and out of breath, trying to explain to my mom and dad what we had just witnessed. "Videotapes? That's odd. Did you bring one back?" Dad was curious now. My mom wasn't so interested, because she didn't believe in the paranormal, so she chose not to believe us. We explained that when Gemma attempted to pick up a tape, we heard what sounded like someone running towards us. Even though it was dark outside now, my dad suggested that we go for a drive to the house and have a look. For some reason, even though Gemma and I were absolutely scared out of our minds, we still decided to go along. We drove slowly up the dirt road. It was dark and eerie. All we could see was the gravel of the road directly in front of the car, where the headlights shone. We pulled up to the house, thinking that while it was scary enough during the day, it was like being in a horror movie during the night. We sat in the car with the headlights shining directly onto the old creepy house, and darkness surrounding everywhere else. My dad, Gemma, and I almost jumped out of our skin. I swear for a second my heart actually stopped beating. It was the sound of a gunshot. It sounded like it was shot no more than a couple meters from our car. Dad immediately put the car into reverse and spun it around to drive off when he just stopped still. My heart was about to beat out of my chest, and I yelled, "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" Gemma was almost crying in the front seat. I looked at both of them, and they were doing nothing but staring directly in front of the car. One thing I noticed on the way there was that since it had rained a bit earlier, there were no tracks or marks on the road. They were washed by the rain, so our tire tracks were the only ones. Then I saw it. Sitting perfectly upright on top of our tire tracks was a bullet shell. It's safe to say that we never came back to that house. It's quite obvious that we were not wanted there. I began jogging on the track at the back of our house, and have had a much better experience. Still to this day, many questions remain in my head. I wonder what the hell could have been on those tapes, and why there was an entire box full of them. Wonder who they belonged to, and why they were so protected. This happened almost 30 years ago when I was a kid. It's still one of the worst things that's ever happened in my town. I was 12 years old, and one of my friends from school went missing. His name was Greg, and he was in my class. Greg was a nerdy kid, but everyone loved him anyway. It was the 90s, and our school had just added some computers to the library. Greg was the only one who knew how to use them. He even had to help the teachers and librarian. Greg wore thick glasses that had the classic tape in the middle because he had broken them. He said that his parents weren't going to get him new frames until he got a little older, so he had to make do until then. I wasn't there when he went missing, but some of the other guys said that it went like this. He and a few of the other guys were walking home from school. When they were walking through the woods, they saw a strange man through the bush. Nobody thought much of it at the time, and they kept walking. They made it out to the street, but then Greg had to turn while the other two went straight. That's the last time anyone saw him. It was like he disappeared without a trace. The only clue that anybody had was the man in the woods, but we didn't even know for sure if he was involved. The police searched the woods and the surrounding area for a very long time, but nothing turned up. For many months afterwards, our neighborhood was on lockdown. I don't think I was allowed out of the sight of an adult for at least 6 months. However, life eventually went on. Fast forward to 4 years later. I was 16 years old and in my second year of high school. Our high school was in a different neighborhood that was about a 15-minute drive away. However, I still hung out with the same guys from my primary school. My best friends were Johnny and Dale, and on weekends, we would usually hang out in Dale's basement and play video games. Sometimes we would walk around and try to find a party, or just hang out in the park. One afternoon, though, the three of us took our bikes out for the day. There were some woods near our place and also some farm fields if you went further. We had been out there for a few hours, and it was 1 p.m. We were surrounded by canola fields on all sides. There was a newer housing development off in the distance, but other than that, it was just fields. Every once in a while, we would see an old farmhouse. These were industrial-scale farms, but they used to be small family farms. When they were sold off to the larger companies, the farmhouses were of no use, so there they stood, falling into disrepair. We had passed 3 or 4 of them already, but after a while, we got bored, and Johnny suggested that we check one of them out. Dale and I agreed, even though we could get in trouble. These farms were all owned by some company, and they could be pretty crazy about trespassing. I guess it would look bad if some kids went in and the ceiling collapsed. There was a large farmhouse up ahead on the right, so we decided to head over to it. We realized how old it looked. The siding was all wood panels, and any sign of paint was long gone. The roof was brown shingles, many of them were missing, and the remaining ones were curled up. The windows were all boarded up, and there were warning signs all over the place, but no fence actually preventing us from getting to it. There was a large padlock on the front door, and it looked pretty secure. If we were going to get into that place, then we would have to find another way in. We walked around to the back. These windows were covered in plywood as well. Once we saw the back door, though, we thought there might be no way in. There was another large padlock there, and it looked solid. That place was sealed up like a dolphin's butt, and it seemed like there was no way in. But then Johnny took a closer look at the back door. The next thing I knew, it swung open. I was surprised and walked over to my friend who was holding the lock in his hand. It had been cut. Thinking it was our lucky day, the three of us walked into the house. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it looked like we had stepped back in time. Everything there was from the 70s or 80s. There was even a coffee cup on the kitchen table. There was a thick layer of dust covering everything, and we were leaving footprints on the floor as we walked. Dale and I went into the living room, but Johnny split off and went the other way, where I later learned there was a bedroom. It was dark in the living room, and the only reason we were able to see was because of the small space between the window frame and the plywood covering it. Dale and I stood there, talking softly to each other. It was a creepy place, but neither of us was scared at that moment. Suddenly, Johnny called us over. His voice sounded urgent. We walked in the direction of his voice and found him in one of the bedrooms on the ground floor. Maybe it was supposed to be an office, but there was a bed frame in there. When we got to the room, Johnny was standing there near the doorway. "What's up?" I asked. Johnny didn't answer, but he pointed at the floor. There, lying on the ground, was a pair of glasses. Glasses that were broken in the middle and fixed with a piece of tape. As soon as I saw them, I knew what Johnny was thinking, because I was thinking the same thing. Our minds all went to Greg. None of us touched anything in that place after we saw that. The three of us quietly walked out the back door of the house and left it the way we found it, as much as possible anyway. We got on our bikes and headed home, determined to find out if the glasses actually belonged to Greg. As we rode, I realized how strange it was that the lock on the back door was broken. That had to mean that somebody had broken in at some point. Could it have been Greg? I told my parents what we found as soon as I got home. They thought I was making things up, but agreed to call the cops anyway. I told them which house it was, but I wasn't allowed to go and help. It was a few days before I found out what happened when the cops searched the place. In addition to the glasses, they also found a jacket that belonged to Greg. I confirmed it. He was there. That was the first lead in the case of his disappearance in years. Even though the house and the surrounding area were searched for several days, no sign of his body was ever found. I still think about him sometimes, especially when I'm passing one of those creepy farmhouses. In New Zealand, we have a lot of walks, and sometimes I like to just drive somewhere and go for a hike into the bush. Normally I'd just walk to a point and turn back, but tonight I decided to walk the entire track. This specific track goes from a visitor center at the top of a hill. Then down the hill is the track which takes you past an old abandoned railway that was once used to show off glowworms. Now it's just a rusting wreck. I decided to walk down that track. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon, and it was starting to get a bit dark. I thought I would explore a bit and then walk back to my car. About 200 meters from the main station, there was an old tunnel used by the train. This tunnel had been abandoned for 3 years at that time. Off I went into the tunnel with my little lantern. This tunnel could not have been more than 500 meters long. While I was walking, over the sound of my wet slapping footsteps, I swear I could hear someone following me and breathing on me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped in my tracks and swung around with my lantern. There was nothing. Just a small ball of light from the tunnel's opening. I started walking again, and the feeling returned. Then over my own breath and the slapping of my footsteps, I heard something. I heard in a dangerous whisper, "Get out." You don't need to tell me twice, I thought. I felt my large frame running through the small tunnel designed for a tiny train, and I heard the footsteps behind me. The light of the mouth of the tunnel was getting larger and larger. I felt the security of the daylight wash over me. Then I tripped and fell onto my stomach while still in the tunnel. When I did, I felt this presence near me. I tried to get up, but my shoulder was killing me. My legs had decided that they didn't want to work anymore. Eventually, I got up, but I was covered in mud all down my front. I finally made it into the safety of the daylight, walking up the railway, looking like some awful extra on The Walking Dead. I reached the small station and managed to sit myself down on one of the benches that was there. I was trying to stretch out my arm so it wouldn't hurt anymore. Then while I was stretching my legs, I looked up to my left and stood on the platform. There was a guy dressed in brown overalls and a white shirt, looking dirty and disheveled. I promise you, I'm a big-framed guy, but I've never run so fast in my entire life. I'm now sitting in my car, trying to process what the hell happened. And in case anyone was wondering, yes, I am able to take photos of this place, and it's not hard to access, but I'll only go back if I need to.